Well, let me begin by acknowledging an unintentional added awkwardness to my sermon title this morning. I didn't realize until bulletins were already printed and slides already made that I misspelled Segway, inadvertently putting in the name of a personal transportation device rather than a rhetorical bridge. I meant S-E-G-U-E. I've never been on a Segway, though I have attempted a hoverboard or two, and I assure you that was awkward. So perhaps awkward Segway is also something I could demonstrate, but thankfully not this morning. Instead, I'll give an example of an awkward Segway I found myself in previously. I lived in Uganda and worked at Uganda Christian University for 5 years as a young professional. One day, I walked into the administration building for a meeting and found a deputy vice chancellor in the room. Eager to demonstrate that I was making efforts to enculturate and to value the place I found myself living and had, learned a few words of his mother tongue, I greeted him with some of my newly learned Luganda. I was waiting for him to light up at hearing his mother tongue from me, but that's not the way it played out. "You got the words right," he said to me in English, "but you would never say that to me." Apparently, the phrases I learned among equals or just out and about on the street were informal and thus disrespectful to use with my boss's boss's boss. An awkward segue to the rest of the meeting, which thankfully was all in English. The author of Mark's gospel is not just learning Greek, I don't think, when he puts pen to page to tell us the stories of Jesus. But the original ending of the gospel is linguistically awkward anyway. The verses Leanne read for us in the gospel were the original ending of the book. If you open up the Bible in the pew rack in front of you or any Bible, you will see a note that reads something like, "The most reliable early manuscripts and other ancient witnesses do not have Mark 16, 9-20, meaning it ended with verse 8. Leanne finished with, "They said nothing to anyone, for they were afraid." The original Greek actually says, "They said nothing to anyone, they were afraid because..." My Greek isn't good enough to remember that you don't finish Greek sentences in prepositions either, but commentators I trust assure me that it sounds as weird in Greek as it would in English if our translation left it true to form. In addition to the linguistic awkwardness, it's a rather abrupt ending. There's an empty tomb and the testimony of an unnamed young man in a white robe and women in terrified amazement. No appearance by the resurrected Christ. No beginning of spreading the gospel. That's it. So Mark ended his account of Jesus, that's what a gospel is, and circulated it with an abrupt ending and an incomplete thought or sentence. Mark is the earliest of the 4 canonical gospels to be written down, but surely Mark could have found some other way to end it. You can't blame later scribes for feeling it incomplete and adding a more thorough or proper ending, which is where we get verses 9-20. But maybe an awkward segue to end with the middle is exactly right. The resurrection is not a conclusion, but an invitation to wonder what comes next, and even to be part of it. What happens after the empty tomb is discovered? What's the rest of the story of Jesus? When we ask these questions, we're also left to answering them, figuring out what this means for us and how we encounter the risen Christ. Our second reading for today, the verses in Acts, our lectionary text for this week, they're a glimpse of Peter wrestling with these questions for his own day and trying to explain. Peter had had an understanding that only his Jewish tradition and faith community got it right. But then earlier in this same chapter of Acts, Peter has a stark revelation in the form of a vision from heaven. And he learns it doesn't matter where you're from, what you eat, what faith tradition you come from, God welcomes everyone. In our verses for today, Peter is explaining to his friends that he knows it's against their ways to associate with Gentiles, but the witness of Jesus compels him to call no person impure, demonstrates that God does not show favoritism. Jesus is Lord of all. He preached and healed all. He was put to death, but God raised him, and we are to tell the good news to everyone. Are you getting the theme? So how does the life and work of Jesus, his death and resurrection, call us to reevaluate, to live differently in the world, to treat others? Maybe you didn't expect this news to make a difference for you today. You came because your grandma invited you, or you felt like it was something you should do. But friends, the good news of the Easter story this morning is that the story of Jesus continues to unfold. God's work shines in uncertainty and fear, as this story demonstrates. Obviously, the women didn't remain where they were in the end of Mark's telling. They had a moment of fear and not speaking a thing, but it turned out not to be the end. I think Mark knew that, even by the time he wrote it. And Mark knew that his readers would know it. And his awkward segue would be an invitation to reflect on how the story continues, how we find ourselves in the story. So I invite you to think and pray about that this morning. How might this good news just make a difference in your life? May it be so. Amen.